Well, I'm just going to talk about some simple ways to attach Clodbuster tires onto a Traxxas vehicle. On the rear, it's pretty straightforward. You just need an adapter that'll work. On the front, you kind of need to space things out a little bit. So if you have an older model that doesn't have the wide wheel hexes, you definitely need to get the wide wheel hexes that are coming standard now on the Traxxas vehicles. I personally recommend actually getting one wider. I think these measure out at 7 millimeters. I think that's right on their width, and I'd actually recommend something a little bigger, probably something more in the 10 millimeter, maybe more range. And the easy way to do this is just to get the Tamiya wheel adapters for the Clodbuster. It'll come on a parts tree, you'll have a bunch of extra stuff, but that's the simplest method to go with. And it just slips over. It takes a 12 millimeter hex just like this under normal on a Clodbuster, which you can't use on yours, but that's not the point. It slips right on, has a good nice tight fit, and you can just bolt it on. Now this will interfere slightly with your steering radius. If you have the skinny wheel hexes, this is going to be even worse. But if you see right there, the control arm actually bulges out quite a bit, and the rim can make contact. Now normally, you're actually pretty close to your normal full steering radius anyhow when you're doing this, and you're not losing a whole lot of clearance with this particular setup, but a thicker wheel hex will help and possibly give you a little bit better of a turning radius. The other option, if you're putting these on the rear and you tear up your rims or break off the little nubbins that are used, because, well, frankly, they all fit into these little tiny holes here. They're not real big, and sometimes they'll break off. The easiest solution is to actually just drill out the pattern and then run bolts clean through with nuts, and that will get you a nice solid mounting point, and it's almost impossible to break these after that. You might possibly break the adapter, but it's pretty slim if you have the wheel good and tight. The other option for the front, which will work in some cases, I'm not going to say all, but say hypothetically, you have something that's a solid axle front end, it's fairly wide, and you don't want a whole lot of width, but you want to adapt over. The next best solution is to install Allen head bolts, like was done on these wheels. Drill them out, install the bolts, make sure that the wheel, or the diameter on the bolts matches your wheel adapter. These are for a Tamiya Blackfoot, and they just snap over. The wheel adapter is actually for a slightly smaller pattern, same pattern but slightly smaller pattern, and they just snap right in as long as the bolts are the correct diameter, and it'll center itself if they are the correct diameter. The only problem with this particular setup is it's not really recommended for high shock loads. I wouldn't put these on a brushless stampede or anything of that nature. But on, say, a rock crawler or something of that nature, or a slow-moving monster truck, they might work out alright. The main problem with this particular adapter is the pin style cross pin here. It can sometimes round out if you apply too much load to them. The Tamiyas are actually quite a bit worse, and these CRP ones are better than the normal Blackfoot ones, but I probably wouldn't recommend this unless it's a very slow-moving vehicle. Now, if you can get your hands on some of the Traxxas wheel adapters that are the same pattern but have a 12mm hex on the backside, then I would say go for it, because it should work wonderfully, and I've never stripped or broken one of them as of yet. But in reality, adapting is pretty simple. If you go this particular route where you're bolting the adapter on the backside, if you need to space them out even more, you can actually put spacers or small washers on the inside in between the wheel and the adapter and be able to get you some reasonable distance. There are also kits available on eBay, which I don't really recommend because they don't support the wheel well, but they'll also extend out from the stock adapter a decent ways, but they're not nearly as strong, so I recommend doing maybe 1 or 2 washers and bolting it together if you need more than the wheel hex is going to provide. Now let's say hypothetically you run too thick of a wheel hex and you're running out of axle shaft. I recommend these barrel nut adapters here. These are available from CRP. You can sometimes find them in a hardware store. But all they do is they thread on. These particular ones are 3mm, so they match the stampede threads. And all it really effectively does is extend the shaft. You thread it on back here, put a washer on here, and it tightens up against the wheel. Works wonderfully. Now you may have to drill out the wheel you're planning on using. Most of the Clodbuster wheels are a small enough diameter that you have to drill it out. But that's pretty much it. I can't think of anything else offhand. I would recommend having some upgraded carriers or the E-clip secured pins for the front spindles, front carriers, just because this will put more of a load on the spindle here if you run into something or jumping and everything else. You might also find that you have to adjust the dampening and go a little stiffer on your particular vehicle, but it's just one of those. Everybody's going to be different. I personally am going to try to do this on a older VXL, the new steel trained Stampede, which I hope this has still has steel training parts in it. But that's pretty much it. Important thing to note though is most bodies are going to give you trouble due to clearance issues. Since this truck isn't actually all that wide, with the stock body mount, you're looking at about a 1/4 inch with the suspension fully compressed. And say at a normal ride height, you're only looking at maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch. So don't expect to run a really wide body on this if you decide to go this route.